Hey, let's unpack this. Today, we are plunging into a deep dive on a case that is complex, disturbing, and frankly, it shifts dramatically as you move through the available information. It's the case of Sandra Birchmore,
Hmm.
a young woman whose death was initially labeled a suicide, but was later reclassified as a homicide by federal authorities. And that led to the charge of a police officer.
Yeah, and what's fascinating and frankly quite stark here is that initial difference. How things were seen at first versus where federal investigators ultimately landed.
Yeah.
It's quite a gap.
It really is. This isn't just about a death, is it? It's a story that, as revealed in the sources we're looking at today, involves alleged long-term abuse by someone in a position of authority,
Right, a police officer.
an alleged murder,
Uh-huh.
specifically to silence a potential witness to federal crimes. And it raises significant questions about investigative processes, potential institutional failures. It's just
Hmm.
really layered, challenging stuff.
Right, definitely. And to navigate this, we've pulled together quite a stack of sources. We're looking at official documents, the federal indictment, the detention affidavit, which lays out the basis for keeping the individual in custody,
Okay.
alongside news reports that have covered the unfolding story, findings from a recent audit of a key police department involved, and updates from court proceedings as well.
So a mix of legal docs and reporting.
Exactly. And these sources are giving us the timeline, the specific allegations, the legal framework, and the details around the investigation itself, what allegedly happened and how it was handled.
So our mission today is to methodically walk through these sources, pull out the most crucial details, really try to understand the alleged sequence of events, figure out where things stand legally right now, and explore the broader implications this case has brought to light, particularly concerning conduct within law enforcement and how investigations are handled.
Yeah, it's about cutting through the noise,
Mm.
understanding precisely what the documents tell us happened, what is alleged in the legal system, and maybe what questions are still being asked.
And just to help set the scene geographically for everyone listening, this story primarily centers around two towns in Massachusetts, Canton, which is where Sandra Birchmore was found,
All right,
and Stoughton. That's where the alleged relationship and many of the critical events tied to the Stoughton Police Department reportedly took place.
that's correct. Stoughton is key to the background here.
Okay, so let's start by talking about Sandra Birchmore herself, because she is heartbreakingly right at the very center of this. What do the sources tell us about her?
Well, the sources describe Sandra as a 23-year-old pregnant woman at the time of her death. She lived in Canton and was working as a teacher's assistant at an elementary school in Sharon, while also pursuing a nursing degree.
Okay, so young, building a career.
Yes. And we also learned from the sources that she had already experienced significant loss in her young life. Apparently, she lost both her mother and her grandmother during her teenage years.
Oh, wow. That's a lot to deal with.
It is. And a really crucial part of her background and where she first came into contact with the individual now accused in her death is through something called the Stoughton Police Explorers Program. Can you explain what that program is?
Yeah, I saw that mentioned prominently. What exactly is it?
The documents describe the Police Explorers Program as a form of vocational education. It's targeted at young people, teenagers mostly, who are interested in potential careers in law enforcement.
Okay, like a youth program run by the police department.
Essentially, yes.
Yeah.
And Sandra joined this program fairly young, at just 12 years old, back in March of 2010. The sources say she remained involved with it until 2016.
12 years old.
12. And this program setting is really critical because it's presented as the environment where this alleged long-term relationship began and developed under the guise of a police-affiliated youth activity.
And that's where she met Matthew Farwell, who is now facing these serious federal charges.
Exactly. The sources identify Matthew Farwell as a Stoughton police officer. He also volunteered and served as an instructor within that very same Police Explorers program.
An instructor in the program she was in.
Yes. He started his involvement with the program around 2012, which, importantly, is also when he started working for the Stoughton Police Department as a sworn officer.
So let me get this straight. He's a police officer, he's an instructor in this program for minors interested in law enforcement, and Sandra is a participant. And the sources claim the alleged relationship started incredibly early, years before her death.
That's what the federal documents lay out very clearly. They allege that Farwell began communicating with Birchmore online, which prosecutors characterize as grooming behavior as early as 2012.
2012. How old was she then?
The indictment states that at this time, Sandra was 15 years old, while Farwell was 26.
15. And he's 26, a police officer, her instructor.
Right. That age difference, and the context of him being a police officer and program instructor over a minor participant. That's highlighted from the very beginning in the allegations. It's central to the abuse of authority claims.
And that alleged communication, according to the documents, it escalated into a sexual relationship pretty quickly after that.
The sources allege that their sexual relationship commenced no later than April 10, 2013. At that specific point in time, Sandra would have been around 15 years old.
Still 15.
Still 15. And this alleged sexual relationship is claimed to have continued for a very long period, all the way up until early 2021, just a short time before her death.
Wow. So that spans an alleged 8-year relationship, beginning when she was a minor.
8 years. That's the claim.
This brings up, obviously, significant allegations about abuse of authority. That seems central to the federal charges.
Absolutely, and this is a core theme running right through the sources.
Yeah.
The federal documents heavily emphasize the severe power imbalance they say was inherent in this alleged relationship.
Because of his position.
Exactly. Farwell is accused of exploiting his position as a sworn police officer and his role as an instructor within the Police Explorers program, exercising influence and authority over Birchmore, who was, again, a minor participant in that very program when it allegedly began.
It just exposes such a vulnerability, doesn't it, in these kinds of youth programs affiliated with positions of authority?
It really does, especially programs run by organizations like law enforcement, where there's such an inherent power differential.
Yeah.
It's a critical point the sources raise.
How do the sources describe the nature of this alleged relationship? Was it just, presented as a hidden affair between adults later on?
No, not at all. The documents describe something far more disturbing and controlling. They detail alleged behaviors that go well beyond a consensual relationship, highlighting aspects of alleged control and abuse.
Like what? What kind of things?
Well, for instance, it's alleged that Farwell actively tracked her phone location. More chillingly, prosecutors claim he subjected her to violent sex acts.
Violent acts?
Yes, which the sources describe as being used as punishment for perceived transgressions on her part. Things like apparently lying or getting poor grades.
Punishment. That's horrifying.
It is. And the documents also contain disturbing claims that he coerced her on multiple occasions into playing victim roles in alleged rape scenarios.
Coerced her into, my God.
And there's a consistent alleged pattern of demanding secrecy throughout all this.
Yes, that's a very significant element the sources detail, and it speaks to the alleged calculated nature of his actions over time. Farwell allegedly frequently instructed Birchmore to delete messages related to their encounters.
Delete messages. From where?
Her.
From her phone. From Facebook accounts. This is presented in the sources as demonstrating a deliberate and consistent pattern of control and cover-up behavior, specifically aimed at maintaining the secrecy of the alleged relationship and preventing exposure of his alleged actions.
So this alleged relationship, marked by this power imbalance, abuse, secrecy, it continues for years. Then, in late 2020, there's a major development: the pregnancy.
Right. According to the federal documents, Sandra Birchmore discovered she was pregnant in December 2020. And she informed Matthew Farwell that he was the father.
And his alleged reaction to this news, how is that described?
The sources state that he was allegedly incensed by the news of the pregnancy, just furious. He reportedly made it very clear he did not want any involvement with the baby.
And the sources mention his wife was also pregnant around that time.
Yes, that's underscored in the documents.
Yeah.
His wife was also pregnant with their third child at the time he learned about Birchmore's pregnancy, adding another layer of pressure, presumably.
The documents also mention a particularly dark and disturbing alleged agreement tied to the pregnancy. Can you explain that? It sounds awful.
Yes, this is one of the most shocking allegations detailed in the sources. They refer to what's termed a pregnancy for silence agreement.
Pregnancy for silence? What does that even mean?
The claim, apparently originating from communications found from as far back as October 2020, is that Birchmore would purportedly remain silent about Farwell's alleged criminal acts and their extramarital affair if he impregnated her.
Wait, she agreed to stay silent if he got her pregnant? That's the allegation.
That's the allegation presented. And the sources state that in January 2021, Farwell allegedly confronted Birchmore, specifically accusing her of not upholding her end of the pregnancy for silence agreement.
Accusing her of not upholding it. What could that even mean in that context?
It's not entirely clear from the summary, but the implication is chilling. It paints this picture of a horrifyingly transactional view of pregnancy, tied directly to maintaining secrecy about alleged crimes. Just a really dark detail.
Okay, so we see this long history of alleged abuse and control. Then the pressure seems to escalate significantly with the pregnancy and this alleged agreement. And it looks like it reaches a critical point when someone actually reports the relationship to the Stoughton Police Department.
That's exactly what the sources highlight as a potential trigger event. The documents state that on January 20, 2021, a friend of Sandra Birchmore's reportedly contacted the Stoughton Police Department.
A friend called his department.
Yes, to report Farwell's sexual relationship with Birchmore. This disclosure, according to the sources, allegedly caused Farwell to be enraged, and it's presented as a significant factor potentially leading to the tragic events that followed because it directly threatened to expose his alleged actions to his own colleagues and superiors.
Enraged. Okay. And just a few days after that report was made to his own police department, there's another alleged action by Farwell that the sources highlight as particularly suspicious, or maybe indicative of planning.
Yes, on January 24, 2021, that's just 4 days after the report was made to Stoughton PD. The sources state that Farwell allegedly asked Birchmore for a key to her apartment.
Asked for a key to her place.
Yes, and allegedly, he specifically instructed her to keep this request a secret. Don't tell anyone.
Why would he need a key? And why keep it secret?
Well, the federal authorities, in the documents, present this action as another piece of alleged premeditation or planning. It adds to the picture they're painting of calculated behavior in the immediate lead up to her death.
So when we look at this alleged timeline laid out, it's staggering. She joins the program at 12 in 2010. His alleged grooming starts in 2012 when she's 15. The alleged sexual relationship starts by April 2013, still 15, and continues for 8 years. Then you have the alleged abusive and controlling behaviors, the texts about deleting messages, that shocking alleged pregnancy for silence agreement in October 2020, the pregnancy discovery in December 2020.
Right.
Then the confrontation about that agreement in January 2021, the friend's report to the Stoughton PD on January 20th, his alleged rage following that, the alleged request for the secret key on January 24th, all culminating in her alleged death date of February 1st, 2021. What does this extended timeline reveal?
It paints a really grim picture, doesn't it? An alleged relationship fundamentally built on a severe power imbalance and control, which allegedly evolved into long-term abuse. The duration itself 8 years, starting when she was a minor in a program where he was in a position of trust and authority. That's a critical detail emphasized by the sources.
Yeah.
And the timeline shows this clear escalation, especially in those final weeks. From this long history of alleged grooming and abuse, we move into a period of intense pressure. The pregnancy, the report to the police, and alleged planning, like the key request, just before her death. It suggests the threat of exposure became imminent.
Why is understanding all this alleged history and this precise timeline so crucial for the listener trying to understand this case?
It's absolutely vital because it provides the alleged context and, crucially, the potential motive behind the crime Matthew Farwell is now accused of. Without this background understanding, the alleged history of abuse, the significant power imbalance, and especially that series of escalating pressures like the pregnancy and the report to his department, the alleged actions around her death might seem, well, almost inexplicable.
Right. It wouldn't make sense without that context.
Exactly. This history, as presented by the prosecution through these sources, is foundational to their theory of why this happened. It transforms the context from, a potentially tragic, sudden event into an alleged calculated act, potentially driven by a desperate attempt to conceal years of alleged criminal behavior and abuse of power when that exposure became a very real and immediate threat.
That makes sense.
Right.
So with that alleged history and context laid out, let's move into the events surrounding her death itself, as detailed in the sources. When and how was she found?
Sandra Birchmore is believed to have died on February 1st, 2021, at her apartment in Canton. But her body wasn't discovered immediately. It was found 3 days later, on February 4th, 2021.
3 days later, how did they find her?
Police conducted a welfare check. Apparently, her colleagues from the Sharon Public Schools, where she worked as a teacher's assistant, had reported that she hadn't shown up for work for a couple of days. That prompted the check.
Okay. And what did authorities find when they entered her apartment? What was the scene like?
According to the sources, when she was discovered, Birchmore was found seated on the floor. There was a luggage strap that was looped around her neck, and the other end was tied to a closet doorknob.
A luggage strap tied to a doorknob?
Yes, and the sources also note that she was still wearing the same clothing she had been seen in on February 1st. This suggested to investigators that she had been deceased for several days, which aligned with the initial estimates made by the first responders on the scene.
And initially, how was her death classified by the local authorities, based on that scene?
Her death was officially ruled a suicide by asphyxia by the local authorities investigating at the time.
Suicide.
Yes. And this initial finding is a really significant point of comparison and discussion in the sources when you contrast it with what happened later.
Because that's where the investigation took a dramatic turn, wasn't it? Federal involvement.
A very dramatic turn. Federal authorities subsequently intervened in the case. After their own investigation, they formally reclassified her death as a homicide.
Homicide.
Yeah.
That shift from suicide to homicide by federal investigators, that fundamentally changes everything.
It absolutely does. It represents a completely different official understanding of how Sandra Birchmore died, and it's central to the charges that eventually followed.
And that federal reclassification didn't stand alone, did it? I thought I saw something about an independent expert reviewing the case later on.
Yes, that's highlighted in the sources as well.
Mm.
In 2024, an independent review was conducted by a former chief medical officer from New York City. After examining the evidence, this expert independently concluded that Birchmore's death was indeed a homicide. So this independent opinion, detailed in the sources, corroborated the conclusion reached by the federal authorities.
So local says suicide, feds say homicide, independent expert says homicide. Got it. Now, the sources detail specific evidence that federal authorities relied on in reaching this conclusion and bringing charges. Surveillance footage seems to be key to the timeline they establish.
It is. The federal documents highlight surveillance footage from February 1st, 2021, the alleged date of her death, as providing critical evidence. The video reportedly shows Sandra Birchmore entering and exiting her apartment building in the afternoon. Normal activity. But more significantly, later that evening, around the time prosecutors allege her death occurred, Matthew Farwell is captured on video entering the building.
He's seen entering her building that night.
Yes, and then departing approximately 30 minutes later.
Just 30 minutes inside.
Roughly 30 minutes. And the sources specifically mentioned that when he entered, he was allegedly wearing a face mask, described as a COVID-19 or medical mask.
A face mask. Okay. And the prosecution, according to the sources, connects Farwell's presence in the building during that narrow window directly to the alleged time of death.
That's right. Prosecutors, drawing from the evidence, including communications like text messages, allege that Matthew Farwell sent a text message to Birchmore at 9:08 p.m. that evening, asking to come by for a second.
Asking to come over right before he's seen on camera.
Exactly. They connect this message and his alleged arrival to her alleged time of death by 9:43 p.m.
9:43 p.m. So that window between him texting and her being dead is less than 40 minutes. And he was allegedly inside for about 30 of those.
Precisely. It points to a very specific and narrow window of approximately 30 minutes, during which, according to the federal allegations, her death occurred while Farwell was reportedly present in or had just left the apartment building.
So, based on the federal investigation and the evidence presented, the alleged method of death wasn't the suicide initially suggested by the local authorities using that strap.
No. According to the federal authorities' allegations as presented in the documents, the claim is that Matthew Farwell strangled Sandra Birchmore to death.
Strangled her.
Yes. And that the staging using the luggage strap and doorknob to make it appear as a suicide is alleged to have occurred after the strangulation, as part of a cover-up.
And the face mask he was allegedly wearing.
That's noted as part of the events of entering the building on the night of the alleged murder. Whether for disguise or health reasons, it's part of the description of his arrival.
Okay, now let's circle back to the alleged motives, because this is absolutely central to the federal murder charge, right? Why do prosecutors allege Farwell killed Sandra Birchmore?
Prosecutors, as detailed very specifically in the indictment and the detention affidavit, assert that Farwell's overwhelming motivation was to prevent Sandra Birchmore from disclosing information to law enforcement about specific alleged federal crimes he had committed or was about to commit.
So, killing a witness, essentially.
That's the core of the federal charge, yes. And the sources directly link these alleged motives to the consequences and pressures stemming from Birchmore's pregnancy, and, critically, that recent report made by her friend to the Stoughton Police Department just days before her death. Those events allegedly made the threat of exposure immediate.
So the pregnancy wasn't just an unwanted personal complication. It was allegedly a catalyst that threatened to expose him to serious criminal consequences.
According to the federal documents, that's precisely it. Preventing the exposure of their alleged 8-year sexual relationship and her pregnancy is presented as the most significant paramount motive.
Why both?
Because this disclosure, especially the combination of the long-term relationship that started when she was a minor and the resulting pregnancy, would have revealed his extramarital affair, yes, but more importantly, from a legal standpoint, his alleged illicit and potentially criminal activities stretching back years. The sources reiterate how reportedly incensed he was by the news of her pregnancy.
And what specific alleged federal crimes were at risk of being exposed? That's what makes the alleged act potentially a federal offense, right? The motive being tied to federal crimes.
Correct. The sources detail several key federal statutes that prosecutors allege he was trying to conceal by killing her. First, there's the alleged sexual relationship itself. Since it began when she was 15, it constitutes statutory rape under Massachusetts law.
Okay, state crime, but how does it become a federal?
Critically, because Farwell's a sworn police officer. Engaging in this conduct, while allegedly acting in his official capacity, maybe leveraging his position, interacting with her within the police program context, could be construed as a deprivation of rights under color of law. That's Title 18, U.S. Code, Section 242. It's a federal offense. So that's one major crime he allegedly sought to prevent her from disclosing.
Deprivation of rights under color of law. Got it. What else?
Second, there's the allegation of coercion and enticement under 18 U.S.C. Section 2422B. This charge relates to the claim that he allegedly utilized interstate commerce.
Like the internet, online communication.
Exactly. Using interstate commerce, which could involve online communications or even travel to persuade, induce, entice, or coerce the then 15-year-old Birchmore into unlawful sexual intercourse. The sources state this is another potential federal crime whose potential exposure fueled the alleged motive.
Okay, coercion and enticement using interstate means. And there was a third one.
Yes. Third, the sources mention an allegation of wire fraud under 18 U.S.C. Section 1343. Prosecutors claim Farwell engaged in a scheme to defraud the Stoughton Police Department and the town of Stoughton.
Defraud the town? How?
By allegedly engaging in sexual acts with Birchmore while he was supposedly on duty and then subsequently receiving compensation getting paid for those hours. Like time theft, essentially, but tied to illicit activity.
Getting paid by the town while allegedly with her off the books.
That's the allegation. And the sources explicitly connect the friend's call to the Stoughton Police Department on January 20, 2021, the one reporting the relationship directly to the threat of exposing these specific alleged crimes, which is why he was reportedly enraged. It wasn't just about the affair, it was about potential federal charges.
So this wasn't, as presented by the prosecution, simply about preventing personal embarrassment or his affair becoming public knowledge. It was allegedly about preventing the imminent exposure of years of potential federal criminal activity and a profound abuse of his power as a police officer.
That's precisely the picture, the federal documents and the prosecution's theory of the case present. The alleged modus operandi, the strangulation, the staging of the scene to look like a suicide using the strap and doorknob, the alleged use of a face mask, strongly suggests a deliberate, calculated act aimed not only at committing the murder, but also at concealing it and his alleged involvement.
Not a crime of passion, but calculation.
That's how it's framed, driven by self-preservation in the face of imminent exposure.
And his prior alleged behaviors, like instructing her to delete messages repeatedly over the years, and the alleged request for the apartment key just days before her death, those seem to fit this alleged pattern of calculated behavior aimed at control and secrecy.
They are presented in the sources as reinforcing this picture, yes. The documents use these details to suggest a consistent pattern of calculated behavior aimed at control and secrecy over a long period, which allegedly escalated dramatically to murder when the potential imminent exposure of years of alleged criminal conduct became a significant threat following the friend's report to the police. The swiftness of the alleged act within that brief 30-minute window when he was reportedly in the building is noted by the sources, suggesting a decisive action rather than something spontaneous. And the detail about the specific staging of the scene with the strap and doorknob is highlighted as a crucial element of this alleged cover-up, which, according to the sources, initially succeeded in misleading local authorities.
Understanding this alleged motive, the detailed planning or alleged planning involved, and the specific federal crimes at play really does change the perception of this case dramatically from that initial suicide ruling. It's a completely different narrative.
It absolutely elevates it from a potential personal tragedy to an alleged calculated act driven by a desperate need to avoid the serious legal consequences for years of alleged criminal behavior and abuse of power that were potentially on the verge of being fully exposed. It underscores how crucial understanding that entire alleged history and those specific pressure points is to grasping the prosecution's case.
Okay. Let's shift gears now and talk about how this investigation unfolded, particularly focusing on the initial handling of the case by local authorities and the questions that subsequently arose, because that initial ruling looms large.
It really does. This is where the initial suicide ruling made by local authorities stands in really stark contrast to the later federal reclassification as a homicide. This significant divergence is a key point of inquiry and discussion highlighted throughout the sources.
And the documents point to some incredibly critical information that local authorities actually received very early in the investigation, like right after she was found.
They do. The sources, particularly referencing findings from that recent audit of the Canton Police Department we mentioned, highlight that just 2 days after Sandra Birchmore's body was found. So on February 6, 2021, the Canton Police Department received information from witnesses described as critical.
2 days after finding her body. That's fast. What was that critical information?
According to the audit findings detailed in the sources, this information included the fact that Birchmore had been involved in a relationship with a police officer.
Okay, that's significant in itself.
Very. But even more significantly, the information reportedly included that this officer did not want the baby from her pregnancy and had allegedly stated that if Birchmore did not get an abortion, he, the boyfriend, would take care of the problem.
He would take care of the problem. That sounds like a direct threat. They got that info 2 days after finding her body staged as a suicide.
That is the information presented in the sources, yes.
Yeah.
Astonishing timing. And the sources note that after Matthew Farwell was identified as the police officer in question, investigative authority over the case was transferred away from the Canton Police Department.
Okay, so they identified him and then the case was moved. But this whole sequence, the initial suicide ruling, the early receipt of critical info pointing towards a police officer boyfriend and a threat related to the pregnancy, and then the later federal reclassification as a homicide, it just seems to raise significant questions about the initial local investigation.
Implicitly, and sometimes explicitly, the sources lead you to ask some pretty fundamental questions, yeah. Was the initial local investigation as competent or thorough as it could have been? Could it truly have been impartial, especially once an officer from a nearby department was implicated?
Right.
Why wasn't such seemingly critical information about an officer boyfriend and a direct threat related to the pregnancy acted upon effectively enough to prevent the initial misclassification as a suicide? And ultimately, why was federal intervention deemed necessary to reach the conclusion of homicide? These are serious questions that arise from the timeline and the conflicting findings presented in the documents.
And then there was the recent audit of the Canton Police Department, released in April 2025. It concluded that all procedures were followed related to crime scene preservation in the Birchmore case. How does that square with everything else? The sources seem to present this finding with some tension.
They absolutely do. This is a very important nuance to pull from the sources. The audit report, conducted by Five Stones Intelligence and released on April 1st, 2025, did indeed find that Canton police officers followed all procedures related to crime scene preservation at the Birchmore scene. Okay, procedure followed.
Check the box.
Check the box. However, the sources immediately placed this finding in contrast with the reality that despite critical information about a police officer boyfriend and a threat being received very early on, February 6, 2021, the death was initially ruled a suicide and later required federal reclassification as a homicide.
So the implication, as highlighted in the sources, is that simply following formal procedural steps doesn't automatically guarantee a thorough, accurate, or unbiased investigation outcome, especially in a case like this.
That's the tension the sources really emphasize. It suggests that while formal procedural checkboxes might have been ticked regarding preserving the scene, the initial investigative analysis or depth was potentially insufficient or missed crucial red flags, ultimately leading to a misdiagnosis of the cause of death that required external intervention by federal authorities to correct.
So the audit finding about procedures is there, but the outcome of the investigation tells a different story about its initial effectiveness, or maybe its interpretation of the evidence.
Precisely. That's the disconnect highlighted.
And the audit didn't only look at the Birchmore case, did it? Its broader findings seem relevant here, too.
Correct. The audit also identified broader inadequacies within Canton police investigations generally, It explicitly mentioned their handling of the John O'Keefe death investigation, which is central to the high-profile Karen Red case, as another example.
Ah, the Reed case connection again.
Mhm. The report also noted low morale within the department, which it attributed partly to public criticism directed at their handling of certain cases.
And the recommendations that came out of the audit, do they seem designed to address the very kinds of issues raised by cases like Birchmore's and O'Keefe's?
They certainly seem to. The key recommendations listed in the sources included calls for increased training for officers in complex investigations, equipping all patrol officers with basic crime scene kits for better initial evidence collection.
Better tools on scene.
Right. Mandating the recording of witness interviews conducted at the police station for transparency and accuracy, and implementing high-level reviews of all death investigation reports to ensure their completeness and accuracy before finalization.
More oversight, more documentation.
Exactly. These recommendations, which town officials are reportedly reviewing and committed to implementing, implicitly acknowledge deficiencies in areas like evidence collection, witness handling, and oversight processes, regardless of the audit's specific conclusion about procedural adherence at the Birchmore crime scene itself.
This part of the story, with the shift in investigation authority, the questions about the initial handling and the findings of the audit, it really highlights the challenges inherent in complex investigations, especially when they potentially involve individuals within the system being investigated.
It absolutely does. It underscores the critical need for thoroughness, impartiality, and, frankly, external oversight when necessary, particularly in sensitive cases that could involve misconduct by those within the justice system itself. It shows how initial decisions and findings can have profound consequences and potentially necessitate intervention from higher authorities.
Okay, let's move on to where things stand legally right now, because the pursuit of accountability in this case is happening on two distinct fronts, isn't it? Criminal and civil.
Yes, that's a key aspect presented in the sources. There is the federal criminal prosecution, specifically targeting Matthew Farwell, and running parallel to that, there is a separate civil wrongful death lawsuit that was filed by Sandra Birchmore's family.
Okay, let's start with the federal criminal case. Matthew Farwell was federally indicted on very serious murder charges. When did that happen?
Prino, that's right. He was federally indicted in August 2024. The indictment details several grave charges brought against him by federal prosecutors.
Can you walk us through the specific charges outlined in the federal indictment and detention affidavit, based on what the sources tell us? What exactly is he charged with?
Certainly. The most significant charge, listed as count 1 in the indictment, is killing a witness or victim. That's under Title 18 of the U.S. Code, Section 1512A1.
Killing a witness. So that links directly to the motive we discussed.
Precisely. The sources explain that this charge alleges that Farwell killed Sandra Birchmore with malice aforethought, meaning with intent and without provocation, and that he did so willfully, deliberately, maliciously, and with premeditation.
Okay, standard murder elements. What makes it federal?
The crucial element that makes this a federal murder charge is the specific allegation that he committed this act to prevent her from communicating information about his alleged federal crimes to law enforcement. That specific wording ties the alleged murder directly to the motive of preventing exposure of those federal offenses we talked about.
Got it. And the detention affidavit, according to the sources, explicitly lists which underlying federal crimes he was allegedly trying to prevent her from disclosing. Those form the basis for the witness killing charge.
Yes, that affidavit specifies the federal offenses prosecutors allege he sought to prevent her from revealing. First, coercion and enticement under 18 U.S.C. Section 2422B. As we discussed, this relates to the allegation that he used interstate commerce, likely online communications, to persuade, induce, entice, or coerce the then 15-year-old Birchmore into unlawful sexual intercourse.
Okay, crime 1.
Second, deprivation of rights under color of law, 18 U.S.C. Section 242. This is the charge linked to the accusation that he committed statutory rape while acting in his official capacity as a sworn police officer, thereby allegedly violating her constitutional rights. The phrase under color of law is key here, suggesting he used his authority or position somehow in the commission of the alleged act.
Crime 2, related to his police role. And the third.
And third, wire fraud, under 18 U.S.C. Section 1343. The allegation here is that Farwell participated in a scheme to defraud the Stoughton Police Department and the town of Stoughton. This is based on the claim that he allegedly engaged in sexual acts with Birchmore while he was supposed to be on duty and then billed the town for those hours as official work time.
The time theft allegation.
Essentially, yes. So those three alleged federal crimes, Coercion, enticement, deprivation of rights, wire fraud are presented as the offenses he allegedly killed her to keep secret.
These are incredibly serious charges, particularly the federal murder charge linked to witness killing.
They are. The fact that these charges are brought at the federal level, particularly the murder charge being linked to preventing the disclosure of federal crimes, underscores the perceived gravity of the alleged acts and highlights the interstate and federal components of the underlying alleged criminal conduct that investigators believe were at play.
Okay, so that covers the federal criminal path, seeking punishment for alleged crimes. What about the civil side of things, the lawsuit by the family?
Right. In 2022, actually before the federal indictment came down, Sandra Birchmore's family initiated a civil wrongful death lawsuit. This lawsuit is distinct from the criminal case and seeks a different form of accountability, focusing on damages and broader responsibility.
Who are the defendants named in that civil suit? Is it just Farwell?
The sources list Matthew Farwell as a defendant in this civil action, yes. But importantly, they also name his twin brother, William Farwell.
His twin brother?
Yes, also a police officer, I believe, and their supervisor at the Stoughton Police Department, Robert Devine, as defendants.
So 3 individuals, Matthew, his brother William, and a supervisor named Devine. And the family's allegations in the civil suit, do they go beyond just Matthew Farwell's alleged actions described in the federal case?
Yes, they do. The sources state that the family's claims in this civil lawsuit broaden the scope of alleged individual culpability. They allege that all 3 named individuals, Matthew, William, and Robert Devine, were involved in sexually assaulting Sandra Birchmore during her participation in the Stoughton Police Explorer program.
Wow. So the civil suit alleges assault by all 3 during the Explorer program. That's a significant expansion of the allegations.
It is a very significant and distinct set of allegations compared to those in the federal indictment, which focus solely on Matthew Farwell's actions leading to her death and the prior alleged federal crimes he sought to conceal.
And crucially, the civil suit also directly targets the Stoughton Police Department as an institution, right? Not just the officers.
Correct. The lawsuit includes a claim of institutional negligence against the town of Stoughton and its police department. The family alleges that the department's negligent hiring and supervision of these officers contributed to Sandra Birchmore's emotional distress.
And they link that distress to the initial misdiagnosed suicide.
Yes, the sources indicate the suit links the alleged negligence and resulting distress to the circumstances surrounding her death, including the initial ruling. This aspect of the civil suit significantly broadens the scope of accountability being sought, pointing towards potential systemic failures within the department itself, not just the actions of individuals.
What's the current status of that civil case? Is it moving forward?
The civil case is active and ongoing, yes. The sources mention that lawyers representing Matthew Farwell in the civil suit are reportedly seeking the release of relevant files from the Attorney General's office as part of their preparation for this civil litigation. So discovery is likely happening there, too.
Comparing these 2 legal actions, the federal criminal case and the civil suit, it's clear they have different aims and scope. One is punishment, the other seems broader.
They really do. The federal criminal case is narrowly focused on Matthew Farwell's alleged direct criminal culpability for murder and the specific federal crimes he allegedly committed and tried to conceal. It's about punishment for alleged illegal acts by one individual.
Right.
The civil suit, on the other hand, while including allegations against individuals and broader allegations at that, seeks a much wider scope of accountability. It includes potential systemic failures of the Stoughton Police Department regarding oversight and supervision, and it seeks monetary damages for the family's loss and suffering.
It really illustrates the different avenues families can pursue for accountability, doesn't it? One focused on alleged criminal actions and potential punishment, the other on broader responsibility and potential institutional failures.
Exactly. It highlights the multifaceted nature of seeking justice in complex cases involving allegations of both individual misconduct and potential systemic issues within an organization.
Okay, let's look at the most recent developments in the case. These also explicitly connect it to some other notable situations in the area, which is interesting. What's the latest on Farwell's federal case?
Matthew Farwell's federal case is still moving through the court system. Following his federal indictment and arrest in August 2024, he remains in custody under what's called a voluntary order of detention.
Voluntary detention.
It means he agreed to remain detained, pending trial, essentially. And it's worth noting he had actually already resigned from the Stoughton Police Department back in 2022 while the internal investigation into his conduct related to this case was underway.
Okay. Resigned in 2022, indicted and detained in 2024. And there's a protective order in place regarding the evidence in his criminal case.
Yes, a protective order was issued in September 2024. It requires that Farwell can only review the evidence in his case when his attorneys are present. This is a pretty standard measure, often put in place in cases involving sensitive or voluminous evidence.
Right. Makes sense. Where do things stand with getting a trial date set for the federal case? Is that close?
Well, status hearings have been taking place to manage the case progression. A hearing back in February 2025 noted that the prosecution and defense were cooperating on discovery, the process of exchanging evidence.
Okay, discovery ongoing.
Then another status hearing was scheduled for April 15, 2025. During that hearing, the court apparently expressed a hope that they might be able to set a trial date soon. However, both legal teams have acknowledged that there is still a significant volume of evidence that needs to be reviewed before they are fully ready for trial. It sounds like there's a lot to go through.
So maybe moving towards a trial date, but still work to do on the evidence?
Seems that way. The sources also note that supporters of Sandra Birchmore have consistently attended these court hearings, showing continued public interest.
A significant recent development, as we discussed a bit earlier, is that Canton Police Department audit, released April 1st, 2025.
Yes, the approximately 200-page audit conducted by Five Stones Intelligence was publicly released then, a major event in the local context.
And as we noted, concerning the Birchmore scene specifically, it concluded that Canton Police followed all procedures related to crime scene preservation. That was the finding.
Right, and it's worth emphasizing again, as the sources highlight, the crucial tension when you place that finding next to the actual outcome.
The reality on the ground.
Exactly. Despite that conclusion about procedures being followed, just 2 days after the body was found, February 6, 2021, Canton PD received critical information about a police officer boyfriend who didn't want the baby and allegedly made a threat. Yet, the death was initially ruled a suicide and later required federal intervention and reclassification as a homicide.
So the sources strongly suggest that simply adhering to formal procedural steps, while necessary, isn't the full picture of an investigation's quality or outcome, especially under circumstances like these. It feels like the audit finding clashes with the facts as they unfolded.
Precisely. The analysis presented in the sources is that this highlights a disconnect or a tension between formal adherence to established procedures and the actual quality, thoroughness, or ultimately the accuracy of an investigation's initial findings, particularly in complex cases or those involving officers.
It implies that checking the boxes on a procedure list doesn't guarantee a truly thorough or unbiased investigation, especially when local law enforcement might be investigating someone connected to their own ranks or facing high-stakes scenarios.
Right. The fact that the initial diagnosis was incorrect and necessitated external federal intervention speaks volumes, regardless of whether scene preservation procedures were followed to the letter.
And the audit's broader findings about the department seem to reinforce this perspective about potential systemic issues, not just in this case.
They do. Beyond the specific Birchmore finding, the audit identified overall inadequacies in Canton police investigations generally. It explicitly mentioned their handling of the John O'Keefe's death investigation, the Karen Reed case, as an example of this.
There it is again.
The report also noted that low morale within the department was attributed in part to public criticism stemming from cases like these.
And the recommendations from the audit: increased training, crime scene kits, mandatory interview recording, report reviews appear to be direct responses to the kinds of potential shortcomings highlighted by both the Birchmore and O'Keefe-Reed cases.
They absolutely seem designed to address the very areas that had come under scrutiny. Improving initial evidence collection, ensuring transparency in witness interviews, adding layers of review to ensure accuracy in death investigations.
Yeah.
It all points towards addressing potential weaknesses, regardless of whether formal procedures were technically followed in one specific instance.
Now let's talk about something the sources make explicitly clear: the interconnectedness of the Sandra Birchmore case with the very high-profile Karen Reed case. These are not presented as isolated incidents when discussing questions of investigative integrity in that county.
That's a major point emphasized in the sources, particularly as the Karen Reed case has progressed and gained national attention. The Birchmore and Karen Reed cases are explicitly linked by shared allegations of law enforcement misconduct and raise parallel questions about the integrity and impartiality of investigations within Norfolk County as a whole.
And there are overlapping individuals involved in both investigations, specific officers or officials.
Yes, the sources list several key witnesses and officers who have been involved to varying degrees in both investigations. This includes Norfolk District Attorney Michael Morrissey, Canton Police Sergeant Michael Lank, Canton Police Detective Kevin Albert, Massachusetts State Police Detective Lieutenant Brian Tully.
Tully, wasn't he mentioned as being under investigation himself?
Yes, Tully is specifically noted in the sources as currently being under internal investigation by the state police. And also Lieutenant John Fanning is mentioned as involved in both contexts.
Wow, that's quite an overlap of personnel. Why does this overlap matter legally, particularly for the Karen Reed case?
It matters significantly because Karen Reed's defense attorneys have reportedly sought access to unredacted documents from the Sandra Birchmore death investigation.
They want Birchmore case files for the Reed trial. Why?
Their stated reason, as per the sources covering the Reed case proceedings, is to use these documents for impeachment purposes.
Meaning challenging the credibility of these witnesses who are involved in both cases.
Precisely. They want to be able to potentially challenge the credibility of these specific shared witnesses, officers, and investigators involved in both cases by using information, statements, or actions revealed in the Birchmore investigation that might call their reliability or conduct into question in the context of the Karen Reed trial.
So information from the Birchmore investigation could potentially undermine the testimony of key figures in the Wright case.
That's the defense's apparent strategy, yes.
So when viewed together, these two cases, according to the sources, they create a broader narrative, don't they? Beyond just individual tragedies.
They absolutely do.
Yeah.
The sources argue that the explicit connections between the cases, the shared allegations of potential law enforcement misconduct, the overlapping personnel involved in both investigations, and the fact that federal authorities have intervened or have been asked to intervene in aspects of both situations. It all combines to create a compelling narrative of potential systemic issues within Norfolk County law enforcement. It raises significant questions about the integrity and thoroughness of local investigations there.
It suggests these might not be entirely isolated incidents, but could potentially be indicative of broader underlying problems with how certain cases are handled, especially those involving law enforcement.
That's certainly the implication drawn in some of the analysis we reviewed.
These recent developments, the audit findings, the direct links to another very high-profile case like Karen Reed's, really expand the scope of this story well beyond a single tragic death and alleged crime.
It really does. It takes it into the realm of larger questions about systemic oversight, accountability within law enforcement structures, and the fundamental processes of how local investigations are conducted, particularly when they involve or touch upon the actions of officers themselves. It raises important questions about how justice is sought and delivered in these complex scenarios.
So, bring this deep dive to a close. Where does all this leave us based on the sources we've explored today? It's a lot to take in.
This deep dive through the various sources paints a deeply tragic picture, no doubt about it. It begins with the death of a young woman, Sandra Birchmore, allegedly at the hands of a police officer, following a history of alleged long-term abuse and grooming that started when she was just a minor participating in a police youth program. The initial misclassification of her death as a suicide by local authorities, and then the dramatic subsequent federal reclassification as a homicide, leading to a federal indictment on severe charges, including killing a witness to prevent the disclosure of federal crimes. That marks a crucial and challenging shift in the pursuit of criminal justice in this case.
And the civil lawsuit adds another critical layer to that pursuit, addressing potential broader accountability beyond just Farwell.
It does. The ongoing civil wrongful death lawsuit filed by Sandra Birchmore's family expands the scope of accountability being sought. It targets not only Matthew Farwell, but also alleges the involvement of other individuals and, significantly, claims institutional negligence against the Stoughton Police Department for alleged negligent hiring and supervision.
Right.
This dual legal approach, federal criminal prosecution and civil litigation, highlights the multifaceted ways in which accountability is being sought, aiming to address both alleged individual criminal culpability and potential systemic failures within an institution.
And the recent findings from the Canton Police Department audit, combined with the explicit connections to the Karen Reed case and the overlapping personnel, they keep persistent questions about the integrity and competence of local law enforcement investigations in Norfolk County firmly in the public and legal spotlight.
Absolutely. These interconnected cases, as presented in the sources, underscore a critical need for enhanced transparency, potential systemic reform, and robust external oversight to help restore public trust and ensure that justice is not only pursued, but is seen to be pursued impartially for all individuals involved, especially victims of alleged abuse and misconduct.
It's a profoundly complex situation, and the legal proceedings, both criminal and civil, are far from concluded. There's still a long road ahead.
That's right. The federal case against Matthew Farwell is still progressing through the courts, with the possibility of a trial date being set in the near future. But it's not set yet. The civil suit also remains active. The ultimate determination of truth and accountability in this case is still being sought through these parallel legal processes.
And the outcome carries significant implications, doesn't it? Far beyond just this one case.
It absolutely does. For victims of alleged abuse and exploitation, especially within contexts involving power imbalances like youth programs, for the ethical standards within law enforcement itself, and ultimately for public trust in the fairness and impartiality of the justice system, it's a case that touches on many deeply sensitive and critical issues.
It's a heavy topic, and we appreciate you walking us through these sources in such detail today. There was a lot there.
It is important material, and our goal was just to lay out what the documents and reports tell us as available right now.
We've taken a deep dive into the sources surrounding the tragic death of Sandra Birchmore today. As you, our listener, reflect on this case and the complex issues it raises, the alleged abuse, the questions about the investigation, the pursuit of justice on multiple fronts, and the potential systemic connections here is a final thought to leave you with. How can communities and institutions ensure that youth programs, particularly those affiliated with positions of authority like law enforcement, have truly robust and effective safeguards in place to prevent the kind of alleged long-term grooming and abuse described in this case?
That's a critical question.
And when serious questions of investigative integrity involving local officials arise, as these sources strongly suggest happened here and in related cases, what specific role should external oversight play to ensure a thorough, unbiased, and accurate pursuit of truth and accountability? Something to mull over.